Hello, class, and welcome back for the last chapter this week. That is chapter 7. So, human biodiversity today. Um, the biological anthropologists know a lot about contemporary human biodiversity, and that is the similarities and differences within and across human groups that have biological dimensions. So this is why we're able to do DNA tests like 23andMe. In what ways do contemporary humans vary biologically? Okay, so we most definitely share almost identical genetic material, no matter what you look like, what your phenotype is. And we have common physiological processes. These are differences that are typically related to ancestral mutations or developmental processes. So, anthropologists seek to understand species-wide patterns, genetic variation, the roles of gene flow in genetic variation, psychological differences, and immune responses to diseases. Genetic variation is mostly within the population, not between them. So, the appearance across human population of certain known genes lead to the idea that genetic variation exists within and not between the human populations. The Human Genome Project confirmed that between 83 to 97% of genetic variation is found within human populations, and only 3 to 17% is found between them. So, and this is due mostly to gene flow and migration. So, physiological variations definitely also shape us. These traits provide a more valid basis for classifications than a morphological feature, such as skin color. Um, there's no really good reason to divide humans biologically, um, especially in ways such as skin color. Blood types, for example, definitely vary, likely due to mutation, natural selection, and gene flow. However, we know that there are only three major blood types: O, A, and B. You do have the AB, but the three are O, A, and B. And how those interact together difference it differs and is part of the gene flow process as to who gets what. Adaptation to diseases, different environments can definitely um, change how we interact with these diseases. A very good example is that of sickle cell anemia. It came about as a response to mosquito delivered malaria, and it is a um, non-dominant gene. So in order for someone to have the sickle cell disease, they have to have two parents who both have at least one dominant gene for the sickle cell. And what it does is those people who have the one recessive gene um, of it, and then one normal non-sickle cell related gene end up either not getting the disease or having an easier time recovering from it. Those without this resistant gene end up getting really sick from the malaria, and those who have both dominant traits end up getting the sickle cell and end up dying because of it. So, but the human immune system cannot adapt very flexibly to disease environments, and when it does, there tends to be problems like the human leukoid antigen system is flexibility. However, resistance would be the sickle cell. So, why do human bodies look so different across the planet? People put a lot of stock in what characteristics like skin pigmentation, hair, facial features, and body type say about a person. However, these kind of variations are overemphasized and widely misunderstood. They are less significant for everyday bodily functions than genetic, psychological, and immunity issues. Skin color is widely misunderstood, and most of us take it for granted. Skin and color. Skin does not have color per se. It has cells called melanocytes. They produce melanin, a complex polymer whose color is either black or brown. Along with other factors, carotene, age, all sorts of things, it affects skin pigmentation. Melanin provides a protective tint from the sun's UV rays and evolves through natural selection. The variation we see today in skin pigmentation is connected to the latitude where one's ancestors spent most of the time. So whether or not they needed to have that protective tint from the UV rays closer to the equator or farther up towards the poles, they really didn't need nearly as much protective tint. So that's why you see the difference in skin pigmentation. So variations are more than skin deep. Humans vary greatly in body shape, stature, and size. The difference between different groups and the range of other body types seen globally raises questions about the adaptive significance and biological dimensions of that variable for our species. Anthropometric measures are taken from indices such as Karmic Index, which is the standing height divided by sitting height, and the intermembral index, which is the ratio of arm length to leg length. So those are the different ways of measuring the parameters of the body. So it is difficult to get much beyond the suggestive generalizations. Migration may indicate that a population entered a climactical region too recently for evolutionary adaptations to have occurred. Bodies can change within an individual's lifetime. That is most definitely true. People adapt to climate through cultural processes such as diet, activity patterns, and the use of clothing and shelter. These then affect the ability to adapt to extreme climates. No matter the body shape, stature, or size, we can always adapt. Are differences of race also differences in biology? Most Americans assume that race is a natural and inevitable aspect of human society. However, Race is a system that organizes people into hierarchical groups based on specific physical traits that are thought to reflect fundamental and innate differences rooted in genetic and biological differences. Markers such as skin color are racially distinct, but they are arbitrary. Race is culturally constructed. It has nothing to do with biology. So, scientific concept of race, a population or a group of populations within a species that has a measurable, defining biological characteristic and low statistical measures of similarity, aka there's no subspecies. The cultural constructed concept of race. A set of cultural or ethnic factors combined with an easily perceived morphological or phonological traits. Skin reflectiveness, body shape, cranial structures. They're all artificially biologicalized categories and really have nothing to do with anything other than cultural factors. Naturalizing race. In the 18th century, scientists sought to naturalize the human differences. They came up with 4 general approaches to categorizing human race: trait-based approach, geographical origins approach, adaptational approach, and the population-based approach. Problems with all of them. None describe an actual individual and none characterize a whole group of people. What seems like obvious racial differences come from a special way of sampling people, that is, isolates one or more arbitrary visual trait and marks that trait as representative of a group. The trait can come to be representative of other characteristics, such as intelligence, aptitude, and character. The categories themselves are not stable. So what this basically means is that you can start saying that people from Northern Australia, we'll say, have blue eyes and therefore they are extraordinarily intelligent. Doesn't make much sense. So, biological traits and genetic features never vary in easily defined ways. Don't correspond to racial categories that Americans recognize. Historical movement, intermingling, gene flow, and human genetic and biological variations occur in a continuous fashion. So, clinical variation as change is gradual across groups and traits shade and blend into each other. The traits also tend to vary independently of each other. So independent variations, there's no connection between skin pigmentation and any other supposed racial trait, such as certain facial features, cranial size, or body shape. So, is the scientific concept of race relevant to humans? No, there is neither genetic nor morphological evidence to divide humans into subspecies. We are all one species. Genetic differentiation needed to classify groups as a subspecies don't exist in humans because there's no single genetic marker that can be used to sort people into races. Morphological evidence must rely on forensic analysis or the identification and description of dead people. Forensics experts use cranial measurements to sort people into populations. We can classify a skull's race about 80% of the time. cranial measurements are based on averages and ranges, so specific craniums usually diverge from the correct range. Forensic experts success rate does not mean these categories are biologically based. Health, nutrition, environmental factors create cranial variations between individuals, not necessarily racial. So, the evidence indicates that race is a powerful cultural and scientific construction built around a set of assumptions that anthropology shows are flawed when applied to humans. Anthropological skepticism about the utility of race for understanding human variation runs deep within the discipline's history. The idea that race is a myth or is culturally constructed might give the impression that race is not real. Race is very real. Racial groupings are accompanied with and supported by marginalization, exploitation, and stigma for some and privilege for others. Race becomes a potent force and an objective reality when manifested through racism. So while we're saying that we don't see a scientific rationale for these different classifications, they are very real. And what happens because of these classifications can be extreme. Racism. The repressive practices, structures, beliefs, representations that uphold racial categories and social inequalities. You also have two different types of racism. You have individual and institutionalized. Individual racism is a person, it doesn't matter the color of your skin, that has a derogatory thought process towards a person of another skin or ethnicity. Institutional racism is what we're usually what we're more used to hearing about, and this has to do with how the education, healthcare, law enforcement, political, all the different institutions that we go up against and how they act towards people of different ethnic origins and or skin colors. So works through the prejudice that people express against those who are different from them and discrimination. Discrimination is the negative or unfair treatment of a person because of his or her group membership or identity. These processes shape a community's exposure to factors that create certain kinds of embodied health outcomes, such as sickness, chronic disease, stress, and suffering. And we have definitely seen this with the COVID-19 come up and come into play, where we're seeing that more of the people who are in poverty, unfortunately, that happens to be a lot of the African American population, end up getting sicker with this COVID-19 because they have underlying health issues that they have not been able to deal with because they don't have the same access to health care as their neighbors. So, cultural processions and biological variation. Eugenics is the study of genetics with the notion of improving human biology and biological potential. Very flawed logic. Eugenics is believed that the inheritance was a simple function of dominant and recessive genes allowed to be claimed as certain groups had low intelligence based on the beliefs of what they inherited. Eugenics is associated with mass human rights abuses. This was one of Hitler's big things with the use of eugenics. Really, racial inequalities in health. Human health results from biocultural factors and is subject to phenotypical plasticity and epigenetic effects. Well-defined differences between racial groups in terms of morbidity and mortality. So these are the incidence of disease as well as the life expectancy. These health inequalities are the result of race, or more specifically of racism, and the environmental influence racism creates on human biology. The embodied consequence of discrimination and social pressures. Discrimination has bodily consequences on individuals. It produces a range of effects from high blood pressure to low birth weights. A recent work shift attention towards the embodiment. Embodiment is the lived experience of racism and social stress within this ideology. So the embodied inequalities reinforce racialized understanding of human biology, and it just kind of cycles on itself. As an anthropologist, we believe that the only way to get rid of racism as a whole is for people to stop looking at racism on both sides. It's going to take everyone stopping to look at this cultural concept in the manner that we do in order for this to happen. So, understanding human biodiversity must take into account the role of human relationships, cultural attitudes in shaping biological processes and health outcomes. Biocultural research challenges long disproved perceptives that reproduce myths of separation of human races, while recognizing that race does have a certain kind of objective reality. Although race has no biological or genetic origins, race can become biological through the embodiment of these inequalities. I hope that really does help you guys. Go back and look at the video that I posted of the founder's effect, and that might give you another layer of understanding when looking at race as well. So that is the end of chapter 7. Go ahead and do your discussion questions and then go on to the quiz. And we will see you next week.